Thought I'd film a video today about my very first handgun, which is this US Firearms Rodeo Colt 1873. Now, I have always liked the 1873, but I'm not at all a historian of the design. So I'm really not qualified to give much of a history talk on them. Obviously, real quick and dirty, before the Civil War, Colt introduced what became known as the Model 1851 Navy in 36 caliber. It's a cap and ball revolver. That is, it did not use cartridges. You just poured powder into the cylinder and then rammed a ball down on top. Alternately, you could use paper cartridges, which were basically just the paper itself contained the powder, and you rammed the paper, and it was wrapped around the ball, and you would ram that down into the cylinder. And you'd have a percussion cap that would fit on the back of the cylinder and act as a primer, perform the same function as a primer on a metallic cartridge. You'd cock the hammer back, and when you squeeze the trigger, it would ignite that percussion cap, which would then burn the powder in the cylinder and force the ball down the barrel. There were a number of problems this could create, like you could have chain fires where a spark from one cylinder would ignite the powder in other cylinders. Not good. Percussion caps would fall off the nipples on the back of the cylinder that they were supposed to be attached to and jam up the works. I'm getting sidetracked. Well, during the Civil War, Colt introduced the Model 1860 Army. It was similar to the 1851, a little bit larger. It was 44 caliber, had a longer grip. It was supposed to bridge the gap between the comfortable belt carry of the 1851 Navy and the stopping power of the older model 44 caliber Dragoons and Walker, which were truly immense pistols that no one would want to really carry around very much. So after the war, the U.S. Army and the country as a whole was just flooded with these percussion cap revolvers. They were the 1851 Navy, the 1860 Army. The Remington had the New Army, which was called nowadays referred to as the 1858. Smith & Wesson had introduced revolvers. There were just scads and scads and scads of revolvers that had been built on more or less a cottage basis, or imported from Belgium primarily, or England. But all of them were out of date. There really weren't any metallic cartridge revolvers available at that time. They already had the 1860 Henry, which had lever action, which had sort of foreshadowed things to come. Fired a 44 caliber rimfire cartridge. Specifically, this 44 caliber metallic cartridge. This one was recovered, if I'm not mistaken, from somewhere in North Georgia. It happened to have been from an area where Union forces armed with the Henry were passing through, so it's entirely possible this had been fired or attempted to fire. This one actually has been, someone had attempted to fire it. You can see the dual firing pin marks, but these old rimfires were very unreliable, so it's not surprising that this was a misfire. Anyway, So they had the 44 Henry, but they didn't have a cartridge firing revolver. European countries were already beginning to replace them. In fact, European countries had already largely gone to double action revolvers as opposed to single action. So while the revolver was invented here in America, we were quickly falling behind the European world on that front. So Colt introduced well, Smith & Wesson had patented the bored-through cylinder with rolling weight. All that meant was it's a bizarrely simple patent too. You know, it's amazing anybody really. It's amazing you could really patent such things. In some ways, all it meant was this. You know, if they bored the cylinder all the way through, you had to pay a royalty to Smith & Wesson for that. Well, Remington, as I recall, just up and paid the royalty. You know, they saw the way of the future, and they said, well, it's worth paying royalties. Colt tried to avoid that. They used a number of different conversions to try to convert their 1851s and 1860s to where they could fire, you know, metallic cartridges without actually infringing on Smith & Wesson's patent. With varying degrees of success. Ultimately, there's a reason why all revolvers are like this today. This is the way you need to do it, is bore through. Well, once that patent expired, Colt introduced the model 1872 open top. It's very similar to this, but like Colt's black powder revolvers, it didn't have a top strap here. The rear sight was located in the hammer, just a V notch. And that was, you know, Remington had already shown, you know, their revolvers had metal across the top strap, which both provided a better rear sight, and it also made the revolver much stronger. It was just the way to go. I think, as I recall, Colt had submitted the 1872 open top to the Army for trials, but the Army, after very shortly, said, hey, get a top strap. Come back to us then. So, a year later, they introduced this pistol, the 1873, which went on to become one of the most popular handguns of the Old West. You know, it was certainly not the only handgun. You know, there were, you'd see Remingtons, you'd see Smith & Wessons, you'd see Merwin and Holberts, you'd see, you know, various double-action revolvers from Europe. You'd see a lot of older black powder, you know, cap and ball revolvers like the 1851. And, you know, it was just a slew of revolvers, but the 1873 was definitely amongst the most popular, if not the most popular. Fast forward to the modern era, and in a lot of the Old West movies, particularly those made in the height of Western cinema, cinema about Westerns, the 1873 is overrepresented. All the good guys, all the bad guys would carry these. It's really only in sort of you know, the postmodern westerns that you start seeing a little bit more realistic range of handguns. You still see these, of course, but in movies like 310 to Yuma with Russell Crowe, you'll see Schofields and you'll see Remingtons and things like that as well. But true enough, these were definitely extraordinarily popular. And they're so popular, in fact, they sort of held American handgunning behind Europe for, you know, a couple decades probably. But The 1873 stands out for having a tremendously wide range of cartridges available for it. It was initially offered in 45 Colt, oftentimes called 45 long Colt nowadays, to differentiate it from a few other cartridges. But the 45 Colt was a fantastically powerful handgun cartridge for the day, and in fact, it's difficult for me to think of too many handgun cartridges meant for military use that would surpass it. 45 ACP, at best, it can equal the 45 long Colt. It was definitely a lot more powerful than any of the big bore revolvers from Europe or Russia or anything like that back in those days. But 45 Colt was certainly not the only cartridge. It was the most popular, but it was not the only. It was also the most powerful. There was also the 44 Winchester centerfire, often called the 4440. It was a bottleneck cartridge that had originally been meant for the Winchester 1873, and because of that, that became a hugely popular chambering as well. It was a little bit less powerful than the 45 Colt, but it was still quite potent, and if you had an 1873, which is the most popular repeating rifle of the era, and you had a 45 Colt, well, guess what? A 4440 Colt, you only had to buy one type of ammunition. Additionally, companies like Remington, I'm not sure Remington actually made 45s, but they did make 4440s, so that sort of boosted the popularity of that round a little bit more as well. You had the 3840, which was the 4440's, sort of little brother. It was, despite the name, the 3840 was actually a 40 caliber, which coincidentally happened to very, very closely mimic the much later 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge. Fired a roughly 200 grain bullet, 180 grain bullet at around 1,000 feet per second. So the 40 Smith & Wesson was I'd say it's a winning caliber today, and the 3840 was a winning caliber back then. Sometimes I've heard the 3840 referred to as the gunfighter's choice because it was still a very potent round. However, it recoiled less than the 4440 or the 45 Colt, so you could get quicker follow-up shots. How true it is, I'm not sure how many gunfighters actually had a preference for the 3840 or not, but I've heard that said by people like John Taft, at least. You also had the 3220, which was yet another Winchester cartridge. The 3220 was more of a small game hunting round than it was, a gunfighting round, but it could be pressed into service. Those were the four most popular, but you had, particularly going forward, you had all sorts of rounds. You had the British 476 Ely. A few were made. I don't think that was a very popular chambering at all yet. Other British cartridges like the 450 Adams and the 455 Webley. Those are mainly, I think, meant to court European buyers, but they existed. Had the 22 long rifle. Had 44 Special, which happens to be like mine. 38 Special, 357 Magnum, briefly. Just all sorts of chamberings. I'm not sure there's ever been a handgun that has been offered in as many different cartridges as the 1873. But by far and away the most popular were, and still are, 45 Colt, 4440, 3840, 3220, and nowadays we could probably add 38 Special as well. Which will take us to my handgun. Back when I was in Iraq, I spent most of my free time either chatting with my wife online or or researching guns on forums, because there was no YouTube back then, or YouTube was just starting out. And I would look on forums or blogs, learn about all the different firearms. I also had my mother mail me some firearms magazines, Guns and Ammo, Guns, Hand Loader, American Handgunner, perhaps. And I remember right around that time, this will date me, Smith & Wesson had released the Thunder Ranch version of the Model 21. The Model 21 is a large in-frame revolver. That's Smith & Wesson's traditional big frame revolver, chambered in 44 Special, and it had fixed rear sights. Instead of adjustable sights, Smith & Wesson had largely, pretty much universally replaced with fixed. Smith & Wesson had basically already abandoned fixed sights on in-frame revolvers by that point. They viewed them as hunting guns, so they only gave them adjustable sights. And a blued carbon steel finish, which that was the first blued steel Smith & Wesson basically since the 90s. Actually, there were a few Model 10s made in the early 2000s, but for the most part, they had 100% gone to stainless at that point. And unfortunately, it had the big, ugly Thunder Ranch logo on the side in gold leaf. But I thought that was a pretty cool handgun, and I wanted one when I was over there. It was chambered in 44 Special, and that got me reading about 44 Special, a cartridge which had always had a great deal of mystique around it. Whether it was from the days of Elmer Keith when he was experimenting with it as a hunting cartridge, whether it was writings of more modern writers like the aforementioned John Taffin. Everyone acted like the 44 Special was this sort of hidden gem that only advanced and refined handgunners liked. People said it was inherently accurate. People even back then would still try to hot rod it for whatever reason. The 44 Magnum had existed for 50 years at that point, but people would still try to magnamize the 44 Special to some extent through hand loading. And then you had the classic Skeeter Skelton load of which was, I believe, a 250 grain bullet moving at 900 feet per second, which actually is kind of a cool load. But guess what? It basically just turns a 44 Special into a 45 Colt. I'm not sure why you don't get a 45 Colt just from the word go. But so there was a lot of mystique around that, and I remember Brian Pierce from Hand Loader magazine did a big article on the 44 reloading the 44 Special and the different power levels for 44 Special. And that is a classic article. You can still find scans of it online, and I highly recommend it. And in that article, he would go through the different types of firearms that were chambered in 44 Special, at least at that point, and what they were suitable for. You had the Charter Arms Bulldog, which is sort of the perennial 44 Special that's been around forever. The Bulldog probably kept the 44 Special alive. Without it, it probably would have died out in the 60s or 70s. But then you had the Italian-made single-action armies, and you had the Smith & Wesson in-frames, and you had Rugers that had been converted to 44 Special, and then you had 44 Magnum handguns. And right in the middle of all that, he mentioned the US Firearms single-action, which was a rather stout, at least the American-made ones were rather stout, and he wrote quite glowingly about them. So I began to research single actions, and I decided I wanted one. I mentioned it to my dad, actually. I said, when I get back, I figure I'll Tried to get 44 Special Single Action Army made by US Firearms. Well, I didn't have to wait till I got back. He ordered one for me as a gift. Ordered it from a gun shop in Arizona. He mentioned that it was a gift for his son who was serving in Iraq. And the guy was already a good price. I think these retailed for like $700 or so back then. But the guy sold it to my dad for $350. So, thank you, that guy. That was quite kind, and thank him to my dad for giving me my first handgun. But the way the revolver came and the way it sat for many, many years afterwards was with these black hard rubber, well, they're not hard rubber, these black plastic grips, which are very similar to the old hard rubber grips that single actions shipped with in the early 1900s or so. Last year, I came to the realization that it was the 150th anniversary of the single action. So I decided I would upgrade. I always liked the look of ivory grips on handguns. So first I thought I'd get fake ivory, but then I thought that's not quite special enough. Fake ivory is always going to be fake. It's plastic. You can get the look, but you can't get the feel. Ah, damn it. Sorry. And so I ordered a set of these custom-made American elk antler grips by a guy named Sack Peterson. Definitely the most money I've ever spent on grips, but good heavens are they comfortable. You know, I knew it would upgrade the appearance, but what I wasn't ready for was just how much it upgraded the feel. The Single Action Army uses the old Colt 1851 grip profile. You know, they abandoned the 1860. For better or for worse, the 1860 is also a great grip profile, and it handles heavier recoil and cartridges a little bit better. But people have always commented on just how naturally the 1851 points, and how during recoil, you know, this totally contradicts modern combat handgunnery, but during recoil it would actually roll in your hands a little bit, and the lack of a hump made it just feel so smooth. By the way, if you want to reduce the rolling motion, you can always hook your pinky under it like that. But with these elk horn stocks, they are just so smoothly contoured. It really feels great. So I really like how that turned out. So that's the grips. Overall, the US Firearms guns. US Firearms is kind of an unusual company with an unusual story. It was basically a hobby business by some eccentric, wealthy businessman. It had been set up in Connecticut, you know, right in an old, in Hartford, Connecticut, right after in an old abandoned Colt plant, and it started out. He was basically making nicer versions of Uberti clones, you know, Italian-made Uberti clones. He was improving the fit and finish, and slowly his company began making more American parts, and so the guns would be a combination of Italian and American. Well, somewhat coincidentally, by the time I read that Brian Pierce article, they had just started making 100% American made. They had just started making 100% American made revolvers. And mine happens to be the 100% American made revolver. It's fairly early in that run, actually. And they didn't make them very long, unfortunately. That would have been around 2005, 2006 time frame. But a few years later, late 2000s, guy who ran US Firearms just up and suddenly decided to make the zip gun, a legendarily terrible handgun in every respect. And he put all his poker chips in the zip. He completely stopped production of the US Firearms guns, so that was that. Mine, chambered in 44 Special, is kind of unusual as well. Not long after I got back from Iraq, that chambering was dropped, at least from the budget model Rodeos. And the Rodeo just became a boring old 45 Colt or 38 Special. So I'd gotten sort of the original gun hipster cartridge right in one of the rare times that it was offered in the Colt single action Army platform. In retrospect, he also had offered it in 45 ACP, which I think would have been similarly gun hipstery, but it would have made a whole lot more sense because those two cartridges are basically interchangeable in power. And yet the 45 ACP is available literally everywhere for fairly cheap, whereas the 44 Special is available practically nowhere and for quite a lot of money. It tends to be a rather pricey cartridge to feed. It's not uncommon you pay as much or more for the 44 Special as you do for the 44 Magnum. So I have not put a whole lot of rounds through this. I have a couple hundred maybe. But after US Firearms quit making the single action armies and they went to the zip gun, they did not last long. Which is sad. These US Firearms single actions, the Rodeo was the budget model meant for cowboy action shooting, which was a big shooting sport at the time. It still exists, but nowhere near as popular as it was back in the early 2000s. They also made a lot more sort of blingy collector models. They made them in rainbow colors, sort of like that, or shimmering. My son's getting impatient. That sort of shimmery rainbow effect like you used to see in cars back in the early 2000s. They made them in all sorts of variations that were either evocative of historical pieces or, alternate history fantasy pieces. But the Rodeo is the base model, and I think it, in many ways, the best looking. Just simple, black, goes with everything. After they shut down, I believe it was High Standard Manufacturing opened up. I'm not sure if they're still around, but they employed apparently former employees of US Firearms. US Firearms, if I haven't said it before, they gained their reputation, the American-made ones, of being the nicest single-action armies made. They were actually nicer than either the old or more recent production Colt models, and they were definitely nicer than the Birdie models and the Pieta. So these have become rather collectible. I've seen them go for like $2,000 on GunBroker, which is astounding. High Standard, I think, again, I may be mistaken on the name, but I believe it's High Standard Manufacturing. Their handguns may actually be a little bit nicer than US Firearms, and they're still available, and they're in the probably $1,000, $1,500 range. But I feel fortunate that I was able to get it. I think the 1873 is a somewhat underrated handgun these days, as odd as that is to say. Nowadays, a lot of folks tend to gravitate towards, everyone gravitates towards semi-autos, myself included. And when people want sort of that classic vintage feel and look, they tend to go for either 1911s or double-action revolvers. And there's nothing wrong with double-action revolvers. I really am not a fan of 1911s at all. But a double-action revolver is never going to match the feel of a single-action army. I like double-action revolvers, but there is just not holding a candle to them. The grip is way more comfortable on this handgun than it is on any double-action I've ever fired. And it also, got that classic 4-click crisp action. It's like a chef's kiss. As far as the 1911 goes, the less said about that abomination, the more, in my opinion. And I don't say that as some neophyte, but this was my first handgun, and guess what my second was? A 1911. I've had a number of them over the years, and no matter how much I try to like them, I always get back to just this feeling of, oof, whenever I touch one. Horrid pistols. Horrid. But but this guy always brings a smiley face. But if you're not wanting to shell out $2,000 for buying one of these, or $1,500 for the more modern high standards, or also $1,500 for a Colt, guess what? I think the Italians have sort of caught up. For a while, I wound up selling it when I was in need of some cash. But for a while, I had a Pieta made single action in 357 Magnum. That one was imported by US Firearms, and I would say it was very, very comparable to this handgun. The Italians were always reputed to be a little bit rough, but guess what? Mine wasn't. Mine actually had a lighter, smoother trigger feel than this one. The hammer had a little bit coarser checkering, but other than that, it was actually a little bit smoother, smoother cocking motion. And the handgun overall just felt great. It was definitely a more budget-minded handgun, but I think they have improved their manufacturing capacity enough that it is comparable. So, if I was to lose this and want to buy another one, or if I wanted to add one in the cartridge that I could actually afford to shoot, like 357 Magnum or 9mm or something like that, I'd go with the Italians. Nothing wrong with them. Speaking of which, as I've mentioned, US Firearms got their start assembling handguns from birdie points, and thus even their American-made guns. You'll find parts that are really meant for Colt. You can find parts that are meant for Pieta, and you'll find parts that are meant for birdie. US Firearms are sort of the birdie pattern. That's about it. This is an accurate handgun. 44 Special, while it can't do anything that a 45 Colt or a 45 ACP can't do, it is a marvelously soft shooting handgun. Back in those days, I became sort of attracted to the idea of a mild big bore cartridge like the 44 Special, like the 455 Webley. Just a big, slow, heavy moving bullet. And I think there's still some validity to that idea. I think I wasn't wrong, particularly as it pertains to revolvers. It is a extremely pleasant shooting revolver. Part of that is just the grip shape. This grip works extremely well for any cartridge, 45 Colt, 357 Magnum, and lower. You know, above that, you may want something a little bit different because it tends to. You know, I've never fired one in 44 Magnum, but I know reputedly it tends to rotate a little bit too much in that cartridge, where you smack your knuckle against the trigger guard. But yeah, there you go. Have a good day.